I'd like to thank everyone for their input on submitting those comments. At this time, I'd like to take council comments, if there are any.
I'm good. I'm good.
I'd
Mr. Cannon.
One comment, Mr. President. One of the comments made in the public hearing said that that they were against the county council increasing their taxes. Sometimes the constant yield is very confusing to anyone. But I thought I would point out that the county is actually lowering the property tax rate. We are not increasing it. The current property tax rate is, as stated in the materials, is $93.46 per $100 of assessed value, and we're actually reducing that to .9286 for every $100 of assessed value. So, as a clarification, the council is reducing the tax rate. We're not increasing it. Thank you.
That was a good point. Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Yes.
That's correct, John, and thank you for pointing that out. However, due to the fact that we're going through the three phases of reassessment through the county, people could see a tax increase on their tax bill because their assessments are going up, correct?
Oh, yeah, certainly, yeah. The
Yeah.
state of Maryland is increasing your assessments.
So if they do, and the problem with that is this is being done in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic. We don't know where we're going as far as, you know, what property values are going to be a year from now or two years. So it could be kind of an unfair situation in the near future. So yeah.
You make a really good point, Joe. Yeah. You really do, and I don't know how we could address that, being as, you know, it's coming from a state level.
Well, like the folks that were calling in from the west side, that's upset about the tank, I sympathize with them, and maybe they should appeal their assessments. That would be a good idea, to appeal their assessments at the assessment office. So,
Good. Mr. Hastings.
Yeah, well, I did want to say, of course, acknowledge that Wicomico County, we still have about 850 COVID-19 cases, and more than 20 individuals, Wicomico residents, are now dead from the disease. People may see us on TV now or may have us call in, but that doesn't mean we're taking it a bit seriously. You probably can't tell, but we are actually spread out throughout the room. I just want to make that point that we still take this COVID-19 very seriously. The other two things I want to point out would be, during this whole situation, I've heard a lot of folks talk about access to internet. There is tomorrow a Rural Digital Opportunity Fund webinar. This is about $16 billion that's available for rural broadband expansion. And so there's going to be a webinar tomorrow from 2 to 3:30 through the Maryland Association of Counties to try to figure out how we could get some of those funds here. And then last thing I'll say is, of course, maybe we'll want to consider, again, adopting a Robert's Rules of Order or something along those lines to continue to have a better, we'll keep that on the radar for something we can do to have the best decorum possible.
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. Any more comments? All right. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for their input on public comments and everyone that participated during this meeting. So at this time, I'd like to make this disclosure: to adjourn from legislative session to go into open work sessions, followed by closed work sessions pursuant to General Provisions Article Section 3-305B7 as follows: to consult with legal counsel to protect the attorney-client privilege, and 2, to discuss a personnel matter on the appointment and salary of a proposed candidate over whom this body has jurisdiction to protect the confidentiality of the individual. And Ms. Hurley, before we go to lunch, you said you wanted to change the agenda a little bit.
I'd just like to make the recommendation of having the CIP work session before lunch. We're running about 30 minutes ahead of schedule.
Yeah, we were scheduled to break for lunch at 12, so I don't have a problem with that. So if you can move up to the table, Mr. Strasburg.
Thank you.
Excuse me, President Dodd.
Yes.
I don't think you got a first and a second to adjourn.
I'm sorry?
You didn't get a first and a second to adjourn from
Okay.
the meeting.
All right, I need a motion to adjourn and go into closed work session after the open work session. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Got a motion by Mr. Holloway and a second by Mr. McCain. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. Thank you very much. Mr. Strasburg.
Good morning.
Morning.
I am here to answer as best I can any questions, or provide any clarification that I can on the proposed CIP.
Okay.
Mr. Holloway.
I'm not quite ready yet.
Okay.
Maybe in a minute.
Now, yeah, let me catch up with you.
Yeah. Well, Wayne, I guess we can talk about the airport.
Yes, sir.
I'm sure there'll be more conversation about it, but what's your total, what's in the CIP for the airport this year? 6 million, something like that? 4 million? I had it written up here and I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, let me try to
Yeah.
find it for you,
Yeah,
Joe.
yeah, I had it somewhere.
Let me get to
Can't
the
find it now.
latest.
At around 7.786.
Yeah.
Yeah, now, are we talking about general fund support, Joe, or are we talking about,
Well, most of it was bonded, wasn't it? Wasn't most of that bonded? That was in the green or the yellow?
yes?
I had about 5.3 million is pay-go and 2.5 million is
Bonded.
old money. Old money.
Okay,
Not quite sure what the old money represents.
yeah.
I think Mr. Taylor had some considerations that a lot of the comments referencing prior appropriations really never came to fruition because in regard to last year's CIP, the new money was never bonded. So what might be considered old money in this CIP never really came to fruition. Might be a concern.
Well, I guess my comments will be about the $18 million.
Yes, sir.
Should we be using any of that money? And can that money be better spent? I know we have other requests for money to be spent. Should we even consider putting that in the capital fund, this money you're talking about, and replace that with portions of this $18 million that the federal government has given us?
Yeah, I think what we need to do, from a procedural standpoint, this $18.2 million that would be coming from the federal government will be in the form of a series of reimbursement grants. So we would, and we have access to it over 4 fiscal years.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, as Mr. Rudy pointed out at the last work session, we anticipate that about 9.1 million of that money will be used for the operating and maintenance expenses for the airport itself. And that would leave on the order of about $9 million available for capital projects that the FAA would approve. And those capital projects, I can spin down the list of what we believe the FAA will approve. So the Piedmont parking lot rehab, new light and crosswalk, $170,000. The Piedmont headquarter and old terminal roof rehabs, $1,436,000. The FAA antenna feasibility study and relocation, about $60,000. Taxiway A completion, $1,008,000. The airfield rescue and fire building, $1,825,000. The the maintenance hangar, $3.2 million. The interior of the UAS hangar, $344,000. Auto parking attendant, $150,000. So those projects would be underwritten and we believe approved, based on the guidance we've gotten so far from the FAA, that those projects would be underwritten and reimbursed through the FAA grant funding. That leaves a significant project that's in the airport plan is, of course, the runway extension. And we talked to the FAA about whether or not that runway extension would qualify under these CARE funds, and we were told that it would not. So that's a significant project that I believe has to remain in the airport CIP.
Part of that airport extension, runway extension money, that would be state and federal funds out of that 18 million, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that
Yes, sir.
that would include county.
Yes, sir.
funds.
That would include county.
So how would this work? Leave this in the capital improvement budget or take this out? And designate these funds for other capital funds that's needed elsewhere in the county, or leave it in and let if it gets reimbursed back, it'll never come out of the airport. So what we're going to look at is we're going to have $25 million going to the airport.
I think what we need to do is when we get clarity, something in writing from the FAA, then I think we bring that back to the county council, because in that instance, we now have a grant that we have to accept and appropriate. And I think that is probably the cleanest way to handle this. I think we should leave these projects in the CIP, but what we may want to indicate in the CIP is that the funding is to be determined, and bring the grants before council as those grants become available to us. I think that may be the cleanest way, but
So are you saying we don't have clarity on this 18 million yet? I mean, we've heard a lot about it, and
we know that the 18 million is available to us. What we need is written confirmation from the FAA on the capital side as to what projects they will support. Okay. We have that verbally. Mm-hmm. We're going to want that in writing.
Okay.
Mr. Strasburg, and to hold that thought, given the fact that there's the very realistic possibility that we're going to be able to have or get back these funds in some fashion. Mardella's not in the CIP. And I think Mardella should be in the CIP. And this could be funds that could be available for the Mardella school.
The issue with Mardella is not the funding. The issue with Mardella there are two issues, really. First of all, the executive has not signed off on the scope of the project. The second is that we are committing a significant amount of capital at a time when we don't know where we're going from an economic standpoint. And I would suggest to you that before we make that commitment, we get much better intel on what the fiscal outlook for this state and this county is going to be.
Right, but the CIP is you're not committing to anything.
You are in the budget year.
Well, in that budget year, but it's still a plan. And if the funding's not there in that budget year, it's not there in that budget year. But if it's not in the plan, for example, and these monies become available, we don't use $9 million for the airport that we have budgeted now because we get it via the 18 million that's coming. And also we have 9 million now that we can work with. But if it's not in the plan, we can't even allocate it to Mardella because it's not in the plan. I mean, I don't understand the harm of having it in the plan.
The critical year is the budget year. And if we put money, and I spoke with Leesville Ashby and Jesse Reed and Micah yesterday, that $2.5 million in the budget year becomes real money. And if we proceed on architectural,
Mr. Strasburg, if you can speak directly into the microphone. Thank you.
if we proceed with architectural and engineering costs on a plan that the executive of the county is not going to endorse, that's money that is not well spent.
Well,
So that,
I guess I don't want to keep this debate going, but I guess then my question becomes, so what's the plan? I mean, the school can't continue to function as it is, so what's the plan?
I don't know how we embark on significant capital projects at this point in time without knowing what fiscal straits we're going to be facing over the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, I don't want to get, I mean, I don't want to keep this debate going, but using that logic, we can use that logic on every item you got in here then. I mean,
I don't disagree with you. I think I told you at the last meeting that we've placed a hold on any capital project that hasn't started until we can ascertain where we're going in this county and in this state fiscally.
Well, I think Mardella should be in the CIP. It's a 5-year plan. It's not going away. We need a plan.
You said,
It's tough with a mask on, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
you said that, any significant capital funding. So the sheriff's department,
That's a project that's started.
so we've already funded that.
We've funded about half of it, Ernie. So the second half, to actually get it built, we would have to borrow the money or take it out of reserves. I wouldn't suggest that we do that. We'd have to borrow that money.
Which will be, roughly how much that's gonna cost.
I'd have to refresh myself on it.
Mr. Strasburg?
Mr. Cannon?
Thank you. We just approved Resolution 32-2020, which authorized to approve Lindsay Rader and Funkin Bolton to represent us in the bond market. So if there's no plan and there seems to be some inconsistency on where we're going in the future based on the county's future budget projections, why did we just pass a resolution to hire Lindsay Rader and Funkin Bolton?
Because if we're going to go to the market, we're going to have bond counsel. And counsel made it clear that before I can engage, or we can engage bond counsel, we need council's approval. So that's the reason I brought it forward. I'm just following your direction.
I appreciate that, but I would assume that if we were contacting them, there would have to be some idea of what we needed them to do. We do have a CIP in place.
The first thing we need to do is we need to go through the $6.4 million in idle bond funds that have to be reappropriated and repurposed, and Lindsay is the best person to do that for us because she's been the person for over 20 years who has written the bond bills and guided us through every bond issuance.
Well, a lot of what we approved doesn't mention anything to that effect. What we approved mentioned hiring them for new money, general obligation bonds.
We're repurposing general obligation bonds.
New money?
Idle bond funds that can be repurposed. And I would suggest to you that we need to repurpose those bond funds for Beaver Run Elementary, or that project's going to go off the rails. And that needs to be done by December.
Can you,
Ms. Holloway?
for the benefit of everybody, I guess, explain the the repurposing idle funds? I think I know what it means, but
When
in case somebody doesn't.
when a project, when bond funds are, all the projects in a particular bond issuance are completed or the project is abandoned,
Okay.
those funds can then be repurposed, reallocated to other qualifying capital projects. And we believe that the best utilization of that $6.4 million is to repurpose the idle funds or the completed projects for Beaver Run Elementary so we can keep that project on schedule.
And you've explained that before. I was sure that's what you were talking about.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We lost audio on Zoom.
Okay, let me speak to PAC 14.
We've done what?
Lost audio on Mr. Strasburg.
Just
Take a
that man.
pause for a minute till we
Sure.
get that fixed.
We should be running.
Len, can you hear us?
Test, Wayne.
Wayne,
Yes,
Yes.
we good?
Hear you now. I'm not sure what happened. We're
Thank
good.
you. Thank you.
continue.
Yes, Joe?
I've heard multiple times you say we're in reason for caution, but in our operating budget, which I know we're talking about the CIP, but it's all money.
Understood.
You know, you've put $700 and some thousand in for the airport. Are you planning on pulling that because we're getting this 18 million from the feds?
Yeah, I think that $700,000 that's in the existing budget can be supplanted by the FAA funding that we're going to be receiving. So my suggestion to you would be, and I'm not the expert on the accounting, but my suggestion to you would be to take that general fund support for the airport, replace it with this FAA funding to the extent that it's needed, and put that 750, whatever it was, into contingency, because I think, again, as we go forward, we're gonna need contingency funds,
Okay.
because we're gonna get some surprises along the way.
Mr. Strasburg,
Yes.
that $6 million that has to be repurposed, does that have to be voted on and approved
Yes, sir.
by this body?
It has to be appropriated by the council. It absolutely
Okay.
does.
And then another question, the Mardella Middle and High School project, has any money been spent on that project at all?
The money that was spent, Larry, was for the, the conceptual investigations as to what the Board of Education and the School Building Commission felt was the best plan for either renovation or replacement of the school. So the funds that were appropriated and have been spent were for that due diligence. So from, you know, I know the question is, was that money wasted? No, that money wasn't wasted. The Board of Education and the School Building Commission had to go through that evaluation. So
Right.
that's what occurred.
Well, I'm not going to ask if that money's been wasted. My question is, wouldn't that be considered a project that's already been started so that we can include it in the CIP based on the standard that you stated earlier?
You can include it in the CIP, but I would again say that in that budget year, which is the first year, that's real money. That's money that will be in the operating budget and appropriated. Do we want to spend that money on a scope of work that the county executive has not signed off on and has indicated that he won't sign off on?
So what happens to that 18.2 million that we get and the money that we were allocating towards the airport? What's going to happen to that money?
The $18.2 million can only be spent at the airport. It has nothing at all to do with anything else.
Right, but the question is freeing up that money at the airport to reallocate it to maybe Mardella.
But again, the issue is the scope of the project itself.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying you're going to hear a lot. We're already hearing a lot from the
I
citizens.
fully understand that, and we fully understand that that school has to be addressed. It's a function of a scope, a project scope that the Board of Education and the executive can agree upon, and then getting more learning with regard to what the fiscal outlook is going to be. I'll put it in terms of your household budget. So if you were looking at your household budget and you didn't know whether or not you were going to have a job, or whether you were going to be laid off, or whether you were going to be, your pay rate was going to be lowered, would you go out and borrow money to build a new home?
I get that.
I mean, I'm just trying to distill it down to reality.
I mean,
Mr.
I get
McCain.
that, but also capital projects, we're talking about 20 and 30-year commitments. So, I understand, I feel like our mentality we're applying to our capital budget is our operating budget mentality. Yeah, our operating budget, we need to be concerned about that because that's a annual budget. But when we're making commitments from the capital perspective, these are 20 and 30-year commitments. So we need to be looking out a generation, and like any capital project. So I disagree with the fact that, we don't, that's why we go to the bond market in times like this. It's the time to borrow money, not the time to run from it.
Well, I had a discussion yesterday with Davenport and Associates because I was concerned about what the credit rating agency's perspective was on state, local, and municipal bond issuances. And as you might expect, that's pretty cloudy. So I'm not too certain that it is a good time to go to the bond market. And I would tell you that I would not, at this point in time, knowing what I believe we're going to be looking at over the next 20 years, and of course, given my age, it's a little bit of a different picture, but even if I were 20 years younger, I would be very reticent to take on 20 or 30-year debt, not knowing where this economy is going.
So we're going to wait 5 years to do a project in Mardello.
I didn't say 5 years, I said until
Before-
we had clarity.
Right, what I'll guarantee you is it'll be, construction costs will be higher and interest rates will be higher, and it will cost us more money to do 4 and 5 years from now to start that project than starting it today.
My crystal ball's not that clear. I don't know what's going to happen.
Mr. Cannon.
Three members of this council were also on the county council during the last recession we had. And the county did not cease to go to the bond market, did not cease to look at what futures might be necessary for the schools in Wicomico County. I think that's what Mr. McCain is saying. There are good times and bad times, but you still need to continue to be forward-thinking. My question, I guess, would be, because the confusion I have, Wayne, is when you talk about, Bob doesn't agree with the scope, but he did go to Annapolis and support the Mardella High School project. Now, what has changed since then? And I recognize your concerns about with the condition we're in now, but he took this school out back in December. In the initial December CIP, he removed Mardella. It wasn't removed because there was concerns over the coronavirus. It was in December this was removed. So
He went to the IAC and supported the need for something to be done at Mardella Springs. He did not support the option that was chosen.
but when you go to the IAC, is that correct? Is that okay? When you go there, my understanding is that it is a little bit more definite as far as what you're asking for. The requests.
This was an informal meeting with the IAC. This was not the meeting where they formally decide what they are and aren't going to fund. Bob went to meet with, I forget the fellow's name, and he wanted to have a better understanding of what their thinking was and what his thinking was. So it wasn't a formal IAC meeting where they make decisions with regard to what projects they are and aren't going to fund.
I think
Or support.
Okay, since then, though, they have approved this project, I
Yes.
think last week or
Yes,
the week
they have.
before. So where did the scope change? What's the scope difference? Because I'm not familiar with
The scope that came from the Board of Education and the School Building Commission is a total replacement of the school. And the executive feels that there is a lesser scope that could be effective.
So when they went to Annapolis, are you saying they were presenting a renovation instead of a replacement? I don't know where the Board of Education. I'm kind of confused as to how things have changed.
No, nothing's changed. What the Board of Education is putting forward is a complete replacement of the school, and that's what went to the IAC.
In last year's CIP, was it just a renovation and not a replacement?
It was renovation/replacement. So it hadn't been, it wasn't discrete at that point in time.
But the figures that we have for the state of Maryland in last year's CIP are identical, if I'm not mistaken, to the funding they've committed to this year's CIP.
No. The funding for Mardella Middle Senior, if you go back the past 3 CIPs, it has moved dramatically.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Any more questions?
Yeah,
Mr. Holloway.
I don't know if it's a question or just a chat with Wayne about this. I know what you said about the cloudy situation as far as borrowing money. Would it look better for us if we could pay down more of our bond debt this year than we planned on to give a better picture of where the county stands out of our reserves? So if we need to go to the bond market, I guess you could say make our credit rating look better, so to say.
I'd have to talk further with Davenport about that. We had really retired the higher cost debt that the county was carrying, and we're in a juncture now where we're going to rapidly pay down debt. I would suggest to you that based on the discussions that I had with Davenport yesterday, that one of the strongest credit positives that we have is our fund balance, and that protecting that fund balance, I think going through whatever the next couple of cycles are going to look like, a strong fund balance is going to be critically important for our credit rating. And remember, the credit rating doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen when you go out into the market and people are actually going to buy these bonds. So that's why I say, from my standpoint, it's a bit cloudy right now as to what the interim financial picture is going to look like and what the longer term financial picture is going to look like. COVID and the ensuing economic impacts of COVID are going to be with us for quite some time, in my opinion.
All right, any more questions?
I agree with that.
All right, keep in mind that we have
I
to,
had a question.
keep in mind that we have to vote on this CIP by June 15th. Mr. Taylor?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes?
Yeah, just a couple quick questions for Mr. Strasburg. I'll hold the rest for Thursday's meeting. On the $18 million airport grant, I've seen some news reports suggesting that the FAA is reconsidering how that's to be allocated. And I'm just wondering if we have any concern that way about the total amount or how it should be spent. And secondly, in this year's fourth quarter, I imagine our airport's taken a real hit in terms of operating revenue. Are we going to want to use some of that grant money to tide them over this year?
Yeah, Mr. Taylor, let me answer the first question first. That is exactly the reason I said at the outset that I want the FAA guidance in writing before we make any firm decisions. To your second point, yeah, the airport is going to take a hit in the fourth quarter. The good news is that the FAA operational funding out of this $18.2 million allows us to look back to the beginning of the state of emergency. So, in answer to your question, any backfilling that we may need in the fourth quarter for the airport can come from this FAA funding.
Thank you.
Mr. Strasburg,
Yes.
I have two questions for you, and I apologize if you've already answered them. I had a little bit trouble hearing in the beginning. But the one question I wanted to ask you is that Beaver Run was initially at, I believe, $7 million in the CIP, and then was dropped to 6.5. Did the scope of work change?
No, Nicole. What happened there is that the and I'm going by memory, I think $1.5 million for Beaver Run is not going to be needed until 2022. So that's the reason that the number is lower for 2021. So the total cost of the project hasn't changed. It's just the timing, if you will, of when the cash is going to be needed.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes.
And the other question I had was on, again, on Mardella, and if there is any, if the executive and the superintendent have any plan of working on some modifications to the renovation that would make it possible to put back on the CIP?
Yes, I think the executive is fully prepared to continue discussions with the Board of Education with regard to how we proceed with Mardella. He recognizes that there is a need to address that facility. I spoke with Bob yesterday evening, and Bob feels that he would like to make a decision with regard to funding, both for the budget year and moving forward, sometime late December or early January, because he feels that we'll have a much better idea of what the fiscal outlook is going to be by that point in time. So, you know, the project certainly is not being abandoned. We're not walking away from the project. The concern is the fiscal 21 budget year, and if we're going to expend funds, those are real dollars. We want those real dollars to be going against the scope of work that the executive and the Board of Education are comfortable with. So there's a nuance there.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Any more questions?
The only question I would have is the original $291,000 that was for planning at Mardella. Has that been, where has that, what has happened with that?
That was the investigation, John, into what the best course of action for Mardella middle senior should be. So that's where the Board of Education and the School Building Commission really undertook a feasibility study to determine what the most effective means of addressing that school, both from an educational standpoint and from a cost standpoint would be. So that was money well spent.
So if we don't act on Mardella within the next year or two, will those same studies have to be done again?
No, I don't think so. I think what would what to Bill's point, you know, the risk that you take there is you've got to balance the potential increase in costs against what may happen in the credit markets. So again, from my personal standpoint, if it were me, I would like to see a bit more learning with regard to how the economy is going to recover and at what pace it's going to recover and what the credit markets look like.
All right, Mr. Holloway?
What have we heard today, a comment, public comments. What about Barron Creek?
Barron Creek, we just recently got the requisite approvals that we need from the state of Maryland in order to proceed with that project. So I spoke with Mark Whitelock last week and asked him how soon we can get underway with that project.
So that's not in the capital program. That's just going to be done out of.
Well, that money's already been appropriated.
It's already been appropriated.
Yeah, that's a past appropriation, Joe.
Okay.
All right. Any more questions? Ms. Harley?
I have none.
Does that include your discussion on the Federal CARES Act funding as well?
Well, no.
He tried to get two birds.
Yeah, we can do that if, I mean.
You're sitting here, let's go ahead
I'm
and do it.
prepared to stay as long as you'd like.
No.
The Federal CARES Act is,
I don't think it's going to take long.
oh, well, it depends on what our appetite is for risk. The Federal CARES Act, initially, the not initially, the first installment of money, the first, I think it's $9.2 million, is for health-related COVID reimbursement. So everybody's tracking the COVID-19 related costs that are being incurred. We'll send those up to the state and we'll be reimbursed for those. The second half of the money, the $9.2 million, that's what we're calling the second tranche, includes business assistance. And the smaller counties made the point that if we're going to be aggressive about business assistance, smaller counties can't afford to forward fund, $9.2 million in business assistance. Initially, the U.S. Treasury held firm that no, this will only be on a reimbursement basis. The National Governors Association, with Governor Hogan at the lead, convinced Treasury to relax that, and the Treasury has agreed to actually forward fund that $9.2 million. And in other words, they'll send through the state and through the State Department of Health, a wire transfer, if you will, for $9.2 million. Here's the rub. The rub is we have to sign, and I think you all have a copy of this, we have to sign a federal funding certification and agreement that if money is spent and the U.S. Treasury, when they audit, and they will audit, determines that the money wasn't spent in a manner that they feel is appropriate, the county's full faith and credit is on the line, and that money has to be repaid. Not only does any money spent by the county have to be repaid, but any money that may have been spent by municipalities that the Treasury doesn't approve of has to be returned. I've asked Mr. Wilbur whether or not we have, under our code and our charter, the legal authority to sign this kind of an agreement. Because let's think through it. We are in fact pledging the full faith and credit of the county to provide funds to the private sector where we don't have as clear assurance from the U.S. Treasury as we'd like to have as to what is a qualified expenditure and what's not. Let's take worst case. There's money that's spent with good intentions. Treasury comes back and says, we don't think that that was an appropriate expenditure. We want our money back. The only way, having spent that money, it goes back to the Treasury is out of our reserves. So we're taking taxpayer money that we've held in reserve and paying it back, having provided it to the private sector. I'm personally not comfortable with being in that position.
Isn't that the way with most grants?
No, most grants, you've got a discrete scope of work, and that discrete scope of work is approved. You spend the money, you prove that, yeah, we did the work, we spent the money, and you're good to go. I think, Laura, I provided an FAQ that came from the Treasury with regard to their guidance on how this money can be spent, and I actually sent emails yesterday to Senators Cardin and Van Hollen's offices asking for them to prevail upon Treasury to provide us with more clarity with regard to what is and what is not allowable. I'll be honest with you, what we're hearing from the business community is please let us reopen. We've gotten very little in the way of, hey, send us money. What we're being asked is please prevail upon Governor Hogan to allow us to reopen. And in that regard, I think I sent a proposal that came from the Maryland Restaurant Association. John Noor sent it to us yesterday, and it proposes a gradual reopening of the restaurant industry here in the state of Maryland, but particularly here on the Lower Shore. And if we want to assist that sector, which is a significant sector in the Lower Eastern Shore, that is one of the best ways that we can assist that sector. And I've spoken with Mayor Day, I've spoken with Executive Culver, and they're supportive of this gradual reopening. And I would propose, Worcester County has already sent a letter up to Governor Hogan urging this gradual reopening, and I would propose that Wicomico County and the city of Salisbury do the same thing.
The real risk here, isn't it, Wayne? You know, if they send us this money and I'm seeing here assistant to businesses. If we go out to assist businesses, there's two things there. Who do you choose to assist, and what do they do with the money after you give it to them? Are we responsible for that if they don't use the money wisely?
Yes, we are.
So I think it's pretty risky.
So
It is a high risk.
you know, to be honest with you, based on what I've been hearing from the business community, I think that a reimbursement model may be a better model for us, because I think we can turn that around quickly, and we can be assured that if a business comes to us and said, look, I did X, Y, and Z, I had these amount of losses from business interruption over this period of time, and we send that up to whomever we send it up to at the state, and they say, yep, you're good to go, we get that check back, that's much safer, I think, than us accepting $9.2 million in cash and beginning to dole it out ourselves without the level of clarity that, quite frankly, I would be comfortable with. The big push for me is to safely get our businesses reopened. Having come out of the restaurant industry, they've already missed Mother's Day, one of the biggest days of the year. If we miss Memorial Day weekend, most restaurants on Lower Shore make their money in 3 months. And the rest of the year may not be very pretty. And I've heard from people in that sector and from the chamber that we could be looking at failures on the order of 30 to 40% of businesses.
Has MACO given us any guidance on this? Because all the counties are dealing with this same thing. So I'm curious what our peers, what's our peers doing?
You know what Ocean City's doing?
Yeah, Bill, I haven't looked at the state as a whole. I've been focused against the Lower Shore because the Lower Shore is so much more sensitive to the hospitality industry and the tourism industry. I think, based on the calls that I'm on each week, I would tell you that the Metroplex counties, Montgomery, Howard, PG, Anne Arundel, are less inclined to want to reopen for a number of reasons.
But I'm asking not so much reopening, I'm asking about the non-health related CARES dollars. Are they all leaning toward taking this and distributing, or are they all leaning toward trying to get the reimbursement route?
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. And again, that's a function of what their code and their charter authorizes them to do. And I still come back to, my original statement that I'm not sure that we're on solid legal footing signing this agreement, putting the full faith and credit of the county and county taxpayers on the line for receipt and expenditure of this money without having a much clearer handle on the details as to what we can and what we can't do. So
I think it's worth discussing because it is risky.
yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to send a mixed signal here. We want to assist our small businesses. We want to assist all of our businesses here in the county, but we're pushing to get more clarity on what the ground rules are, and I think we need that, and I think we need for Mr. Wilbur and Mr. Taylor to weigh in on what legal foundation we have to sign this document.
All right, Mr. Hastings.
If we are grant administrators, essentially, do we have a, as with most situations, if you're grant administrators, you get like a certain portion of the cut or something over the top to help administrator to offset the cost. Do we have the staffing to administer this, or is this something that we would work with like SWED or somebody like that?
We would probably go through, I think the best vehicle is SWED. We don't have the bandwidth to do that. I'm not sure SWED has the bandwidth to do that, but under this guidance, we can likely engage a professional firm that would keep us on the right side of the ledger, if you will, and that would be an allowable expense under this CARES funding. And we've had discussions about that with Dave Ryan.
Reimbursable grant, by the way, definitely the way to go.
Reimbursable grant is clean.
Yeah.
You vet it up front.
Any more questions?
I do have one question.
Ms. Hurley, go ahead.
So, Mr. Strasburg, the packet that's in the brief book,
Yes.
that was sent to the state of Maryland, is that correct?
Yes.
Did we get a response from them as to any feedback and what they thought?
Yeah, they thought that was that May 1 deadline
Yeah.
that they gave us, I think, on like April 28th. And we sent it up, and they thanked us for the package and sent us this federal funding certification and agreement.
Oh, that was the response.
Yeah. So they didn't say, they
Okay.
certainly didn't say they don't see anything wrong with it, but you'll notice in the package, we posed questions that,
Right.
we don't have clarity from. And that's not the state's fault. That's not Commerce. That's the U.S. Treasury. And you all, I'm sure, are seeing what's going on at the federal level. And for little old Wicomico County to get on the radar screen with the U.S. Treasury is why I went to the two senators' offices to see if they could get us some intel, some clarity, some advice as to what we can and can't do with these funds. And I got an immediate response. They're working on it, and hopefully that picture will clear over the next, say, 7 days.
All right.
And then, I mean, just for clarification, there's two different pots of money that we're talking about. We're talking about the 18 million that would go to the airport, and then we have another, I believe it's 9 million that would come to the county. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are actually three. There are actually three pots of money. There is money that's coming through MEMA, and that's coming through our Department of Emergency Management Services. That's reimbursable, and we get, for qualifying expenditures, we get a 75% funding from MEMA. There's $18.2 million coming through the FAA to the airport. There's $18.2 million for COVID coming through the health department. The first $9.2 million of that is specifically restricted to health-related COVID expenditures. Whatever isn't spent out of that first $9.2 million can migrate to the business assistance $9.2 million. And that first tranche is very simple because that's reimbursable. The second tranche, the business assistance portion, is where it's tricky. It's tricky, and that portion of this funding is where I'm urging a little bit more deliberation before we make decisions. And I think we can do that rather quickly. I'm not saying it'll be another month, but I think we're at least a week away from having a really solid recommendation that we would bring back.
And that money has to be used by the end of the calendar year.
That's the other issue with it. That money has to be used by December of 2020. You know, pointed out to the senators' offices that I honestly don't think that's a realistic time frame.
It's
You know,
interesting that they pulled those two funds together to try to get you to take one to get the other one. So you have to take
yeah,
both.
yeah.
You have to take both.
Yeah, and I mean, the issue is the business recovery is going to take longer than the end of this calendar year. And so you're in time compression. You don't have the level of clarity that you're comfortable with as to what you can and can't do. And when you mix that together, that's where you can make mistakes because you're rushing to get money out the door. And I think that has pitfalls, and I'm concerned about that.
All right. Need a motion to adjourn? All in favor?
Aye.
Motion to adjourn. We'll come back at about 12:45 and start with the next open session.
Thank you.